and it is all yours, Dillon.
Thanks, Cody. Everybody hear me okay?
Yep, we can see, we can hear, good to go.
All right, sounds good. So I'm going to be presenting on research that I've been conducting over the past several years, along with a lot of engagement that we've been conducting with folks like you all across the state, and even more broadly throughout the Great Plains. This research was funded by Game and Parks, so I want to give them an especially big thank you. And let's get going. So I added this slide after listening to Chris Helser's presentation because I wanted to show that grasslands are pretty cool. They're dispersed globally. They require fire to exist. They support our livelihoods. They produce food, water, and they support some of the most iconic and interesting species on the planet. So great ecosystem. Unfortunately, globally, this ecosystem is transitioning to woody dominance. Tree invasions or woody encroachment by native and non-native species are happening across the world's grasslands. So the question that drove this research was, how do we conserve grasslands in an era of woody transitions? Woody encroachment, or specifically encroachment by eastern red cedar, is listed as a conservation threat in every ecoregion in Nebraska, in the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project. The majority of our BULs, where we prioritize grassland conservation, are threatened by woody encroachment by at least one species. So, what are our strategies for conserving grasslands? If we follow the money, what we see is that among our conservation practices, we spend the most money on brush management. Nearly half of conservation funds from NRCS programs are allocated to brush management in Nebraska and in the Great Plains. So what we have with brush management is mechanical treatments that are used to restore a grassland from a degraded state. So it's an inherently reactive strategy because we focus on removing the woody plants. We now have the data to assess how this strategy has worked in the Great Plains. So I want to just point out here that we're kind of living through the brush management experiment. The Great Plains grasslands have been maintained for about 8,000 years by fire. We're just now starting an experiment to see if we can maintain those grasslands with anything other than fire. So brush management is primarily what we're using to conserve these grasslands. What this map here shows is changes in plant functional groups from 1990 to 2018. Everywhere in red, on this map, we've had a loss in perennial plants. In blue, we've had increasing cover by perennial plants. What this shows here is woody encroachment. Everywhere in blue is where we're having a positive trend in trees on the landscape. What you'll notice about this map is there's very little red. This describes the threats facing rangelands today. Among all of our plant functional groups, woody plants are increasing the most, supporting a risk of woody encroachment to our grassland resources. Using similar data, we can track the transition between grass to woody dominance. So this map shows these transitions. This is Halsey National Forest. It's red. This is the Black Hills. What we have in red is where we have the most severe woody transitions. So it's transition from grass to woody dominated. Everywhere in blue looks more like this, like a grass dominated ecosystem. So this is 2000, this is 2018. So we see this wave of woody transition sweeping across the Great Plains. Over the course of the last Farm Bill, there was $177 million spent on brush management. So despite these large investments to brush management, we're seeing these major increases in tree cover at large scales. A little bit closer to home, if we look at Nebraska and in our biologically unique landscapes where we're targeting conservation in the state. If we look at the BULs with grassland communities as a priority, we tend to see trends of woody encroachment. So shortgrass prairie is the only ecoregion in Nebraska without a significant trend in woody encroachment. Majority of our BULs are increasingly becoming tree dominated. The major exception is the Les Canyons, where we have evidence that management has stabilized woody encroachment. There's other BULs like the Middle Niobrara, where wildfires appear to have done the same thing. But the Les Canyons is the only example where we've seen management halt woody encroachment. So if we think about these results and we take a critical look at the brush management strategy, again, we're prioritizing restoration from a degraded state to a grassland state. So we're working in the red. Well, given the rates of woody plant encroachment, with the rates of woody plant encroachment, they've exceeded our capacity to prioritize working in the red. For example, listening to Ben's talk about the economy of time and money, if we have to work everywhere, it just simply becomes too time and economically intensive. So if we're treating 200,000 acres of densely infested lands, that's going to cost somewhere around $50 million. So we simply can't manage everywhere. And that's one of the key challenges to confronting this issue. New strategies we need to start considering how we can defend our intact grasslands from woody plant encroachment. So switching priorities to our most intact, valuable resources and preventing them from becoming degraded. This requires us to understand what makes grasslands vulnerable to woody encroachment. Again, so we can't manage everywhere, but with current trends, there's an increasing need for management. So understanding where our intact grasslands are and how we can prevent them from becoming vulnerable has to be considered in new management strategies. All right, so when we think about vulnerability in grasslands and borrowing from the IPCC's vulnerability framework, there are three components that are critical to understanding what makes grasslands vulnerable to woody encroachment. That is sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity. Exposure for woody plant encroachment is the seed source. It's contact between the system and the seed source. So we've introduced seed sources to our landscapes, and we have, through fire suppression, allowed those seed sources to grow in the landscape. In the past couple of months, we conducted some research at Hals National Forest where we looked at spread from a windbreak. And so we wanted to walk from the windbreak as far into the grassland as we could until we no longer saw encroachment. We walked several miles and were unable to find the cutoff in most places at Hals National Forest. So this is 50-some years of encroachment from a windbreak right here. And we can just see these massive increases in exposure or seed sources on the landscape. Historically, the Great Plains had very little exposure to seed sources. Trees were rare species in the Great Plains, maintained as rare species by fire. Sensitivity. So this is the extent to which a grassland can experience woody plant encroachment and the rate of woody plant encroachment. We've conducted research in the sandhills that shows that all sandhills grasslands that can support mature trees are sensitive to woody plant encroachment. Okay, climates in the Great Plains are capable of supporting tree cover. And so they are all, by definition, sensitive to woody plant encroachment. The degree of sensitivity is largely dependent on things like fire vegetation feedbacks, climate, soils, hydrology. They're going to influence the rate of woody plant encroachment. Historically, fire vegetation feedbacks in the Great Plains prevented woody encroachment. Seeds could not persist in grasslands. They could not germinate in grasslands. Tree recruitment could not occur, all because of these really, really strong fire barriers to the encroachment process. And we have adaptive capacity, the potential of a system to reduce impacts from stresses or perturbations. Adaptive capacity is management. It's cultural will. It's when communities come together to confront woody encroachment. It's our cost share programs that we use to incentivize encroachment in our priority landscapes. Adaptive capacity alone can be used to reduce the overall vulnerability of a landscape, but I will say it's most powerful when we can use it to directly control exposure and sensitivity. The ways we can do that with sensitivity is by restoring those grassland fire feedbacks. For exposure, we can manage the seed source. We have all these tools that we can use to manage the size and density of propagules on the landscape. Okay, so thinking about how this can all be operationalized, we need to think about the woody plant encroachment process. We start off with an intact grassland. Historically, this represented the majority of the Great Plains. These grasslands are treeless at large scales with no incoming seed sources. Then we go into dispersal phase where we have a grassland that has incoming seeds, but is still treeless. We move on to the young sporophyte stage, or the recruitment phase, where we have recruitment of young trees. These trees are not reproductive, so they're not seed producing, but we're entering into to the later stages of woody encroachment. Then we have the encroachment stage. This is traditionally prioritized with brush management. It is actually a late transition stage because we have spread by mature plants. Those plants are actually increasing exposure on the landscape, making neighboring grasslands more vulnerable to encroachment. The final stage is a state transition to a woody dominated state. With a new proactive focus, if these stages can be targeted, especially our intact grasslands, represents a way for reducing vulnerability on the landscape. These intact grasslands are not vulnerable to encroachment because they have no exposure. Without seed sources, woody plant encroachment cannot occur. So our management can target all of these categories. Methods that we're currently using every day. The reality of a single restoration, though, is not that we can take something from a state transition or an encroachment phase all the way back to an intact grassland. We've measured this in the Les Canyons, and what we see is following a single restoration, you have rapid re-encroachment. Jen talked about this in her talk. Right around that 8-year mark, you have this really rapid increase in tree cover and recovery back to that woodland state. This is because our treatments are often implemented in places where they're going to have seeds coming in from outside. They're also going to have seed banks. A single restoration doesn't address those things. What we need to do is move closer to grassland rehabilitation, and this is being done in many of our landscapes where we're combining multiple treatments to move more towards an intact grassland phase, where those grasslands are no longer compromised by incoming seed sources. So, wanted to show what is possible with current tools. All of our tools that we're currently using here, just a few, are capable of moving towards earlier demographic stages of the woody encroachment process. We have mechanical removal, which can move us closer to the recruitment phase. We have hand removal. Hand removal can actually take us from an early encroachment phase or recruitment phase, and if we use it to deplete the seed bank when we no longer have incoming seed sources, can actually be used to move us towards an intact grassland. Fire is the only conservation practice that can that can do anything. It can move us from a state transition all the way to an intact grassland. Although it's rare, it is possible. What's more realistic is tying together treatments over time, coordinating these treatments to create intact grasslands. So I know this session is about fire. Some people don't like fire. Well, you can get to an intact grassland without using fire. That's possible. It's going to take more work and probably cost more money, but it is possible. We also can tie together treatments like fire. Where in the Les Canyons, they're using high intensity fire. However, most of those fires are removing about 85% of the trees. So you need something else if you want to really get to that intact stage to remove the remaining tree cover. Implementing a fire return interval, something that can reduce or exhaust the seed bank, can get you to an intact grassland phase. And this is all assuming that we're implementing our treatments in places where we're not going to be compromised by incoming seeds. All right, so thinking about our management philosophy. When we have our intact grasslands, this is where there's no woody plants to be managed. This is where we can focus on increasing heterogeneity, building heterogeneity in our grasslands, improvement practices, or harvesting resources. In the dispersal phase, fire is the only thing that can maintain a grassland in a dispersal phase. If we have a windbreak and that windbreak's constantly shedding seeds into a pasture, fire is the only thing that can prevent that from going to recruitment phase. We can manage the recruitment phase, and that is by preventing seed development of trees in that zone. So that can be done with or without fire, although as Jen mentioned, it can be increasingly difficult to do in some grasslands, especially when you have a lot of propagules coming into the environment. So if we tie all this together, and we talked with stakeholders across the state and in Kansas, what's emerged is this spatial game plan for tying everything together. And that starts with defending the core, growing the core, and mitigating impacts. So if we think about a landscape, we're going to have cores, we're going to have recruitment zones, we're going to have dispersal zones, degraded state and encroachment zones. If we zoom in on a landscape,
Sorry.
Thanks, Cody. We can put this together, we can map out our strategy. So we start with our intact grasslands. By defending our intact grasslands, that requires managing on the boundaries. If we can prevent new seed sources from emerging in the yellow, we can defend our intact grasslands. What this does is it anchors conservation efforts to our most intact grasslands. We can grow intact grasslands. To grow intact grasslands, we're managing in the encroachment zones and the state transition zone. We're shifting those to the recruitment or dispersal phase, and eventually we're incorporating them into the core. Then we have our most degraded landscapes, where management needs to consider the risk that landscape poses to surrounding landscapes and the ability to transform or rehabilitate that landscape. All right, so we have several examples of where this strategy is already being implemented or is starting to be implemented on the landscape. So this shows Hals National Forest. Everywhere in red in 2010 is in the encroachment zone. Like I said, we walked from here about 5 miles into this grassland and we're unable to find areas where encroachment wasn't occurring. By 2020, they had established cores. So these areas have been treated mechanically and then followed up with fire to reduce for seed bank depletion. These are their intact cores. The strategy over time is to build these cores. On this boundary zone, you're going to have incoming seed sources from the encroachment and state transition zones. Their strategy for maintaining those zones is to implement a fire return interval that can actually, that's sufficient to prevent those recruiting trees from becoming reproductively viable. By 2030, they'd like to have a core established on the western half of the property. Another example is in the Red Hills of Kansas. This was a group of landowners, a prescribed burn association, undergoing a state transition to woody dominance, doing about all they could to manage it with current strategies. In 2016, a wildfire created a massive opportunity to establish a core in this landscape. They're now using management today to help defend this core and prevent that re-encroachment process so that they can actually establish this area as a large intact core. A little closer to home, we have the Verdigris-Bazile biologically unique landscape. They're implementing a new strategy to anchor conservation in their most intact, valuable grassland areas and then build on those areas over time. And I'll say on that one, check out Kyle's talk tomorrow. He's going to be talking a lot more about that. So thank you. I'll end there. I know I went just a little over.